Welcome back to Bisexual Killjoy, the place where we know bisexuality isn't a phase, it's a phenomenon. I'm Bailey, and this is
Jace.
In today's episode, Parenting While Bi+, we're exploring the intersection of Bi+ identity and parenting. Now, this is a topic that many of our listeners have requested that we do an episode on, which isn't surprising given how many Bi+ people are parents, which we will get into as we go along. But since we aren't the experts in this arena, we are excited that Dr. Ellen Davenport-Pleasance is with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Ellen Davenport-Pleasance is a bisexual researcher who recently finished her PhD at University College London. Congratulations! Her PhD focused on families with bisexual plus mothers and explored minority stress, mental health, and family functioning using a mixture of both qual and quant methods. Prior to her PhD, she completed an MPhil in psychology at the University of Cambridge, during which she conducted a qualitative study on bisexual plus mothers, focusing on how they came out to their children and their queer socialization practices. As well as conducting research, Ellen has taught social science/psychology at 4 universities in the UK and is the director of the Bisexual Research Group. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me. I feel like a bit of a fangirl after listening to so many podcasts by you, and now I see you and I'm seeing behind the curtain.
Yeah, you're seeing literally behind my row of clothes that are used to muffle up the sounds. Not a bisexual in the closet. Well, before we even jump into all of this stuff, I would love to hear how you came to be a Bi+ researcher and got involved with and now direct the Bisexual Research Group.
Yeah, so actually I was thinking about this beforehand, and I think it's just been 5 years of being a bisexual killjoy. So if we go back in time 5-ish years, maybe 6 years now, I was doing my undergrad in psychology at the University of Cambridge, and I was in my final year, and I took a module on the family. And I'd always been interested in families. It's something most of us have experiences with. I wanted to kind of find out a bit more from a psychology standpoint. Also, we all have kind of experiences with a lot of people want to become parents or have experiences with friends who are parents. So I was just interested in learning more about families. And one lecture that was listed as part of this course was a lecture on LGBTQ parents. And I was really excited for this. I was like, finally, something queer. I've waited 3 years of my degree for something queer. Finally, I'm going to hear something about bisexuality. And then, unfortunately, I mean, it was a brilliant lecture, and we learned a lot about the research that had been conducted on lesbian and gay parents. And it was really important research that was really useful for court cases where lesbian mothers were losing custody of their children. And it was really, really important research. But I was just left with this kind of sadness that there wasn't as much on bisexuality. So I thought, okay, maybe it's out there and it just wasn't included in the lecture because maybe there just wasn't enough time. So I started searching, and yeah, it wasn't really out there. So, it's the big, I don't know. It always happens, doesn't it? We're just not there. So yeah. I thought, okay, well, no one else is going to do this research, so I guess it has to be me.
Yeah, nothing like spite to launch into a research project.
So I think, yeah, that's the ultimate bisexual killjoy moment of, okay, well, I guess if no one else is talking about my parents, then it has to be me to do it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, at the time I was already researching families. I was looking at children's gender socialization. So I was looking at the toys that parents provided to their children, and basically were boys and girls. I mean, it's kind of a binary conceptualization, but were boys and girls being provided with different toys before the age of 4, which I guess you're going to know the answer to this. Yes.
Yeah.
With boys being given significantly more vehicles and like toys with wheels than girls. So I was already in the kind of sphere of family research. But at the time I was kind of coming to the end of my undergrad, and I thought, what now? I thought I really want to do this bisexual research. So I applied to do a master's, and I was lucky enough to be given money from the Economic and Social Research Council. So they funded actually 4 years. So my master's and my PhD. And I was like, yes, now I get to spend 4 years of my life researching Bi+ parents, and I can be the one to actually put something out there. I mean, there was a tiny bit before, but I just had so many questions left. And I just thought, this is another way that we're being erased. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I was lucky enough to be given that funding.
That's great. I'm glad to hear it.
I do feel like this is such a tale as old as time kind of vibe. Every time we chat about how did you come to Bi+ research, it's like, well, you see, nobody else was doing it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Bailey and I profoundly resonate with this story. I still, to this day, have never been assigned a reading that covers Bi+ folks specifically. A small sidebar on my current frustrations is that I refuse to read out a book that says experiences of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans folks in anything, because I know for a fact that it's just LG. I am so tired of bothering and never finding ourselves represented, which is why I find it so important the work that you're currently doing with the Bisexual Research Group. We've been to at least a few meetings that they've had, and it's been so great.
Yeah, just to see the other nerds in the world also doing Bi+ research and knowing how important it is. Have you been involved with them for 5 years, or how did you even stumble upon BRG?
So, yeah, I started this master's where I was researching bisexuality, researching Bi+ mothers, and I was in this really wonderful team of researchers who were all looking at different aspects of family from one standpoint or another. But the thing with this group was, and even though it was a very kind of progressive group looking at assisted reproduction and donor sperm and donor eggs and surrogacy and the ways that queer people can build families, looking at all different types of families, I was the only one working on bisexuality. So I was missing that kind of connection to other people working on and talking about bisexuality. So I guess I just searched up bisexual research and stumbled across the BRG, which Julia Shaw obviously founded back in, I think, 2019.
Yeah.
And that was my first conference that I ever presented at. And it was just such a lovely experience to be around people talking about bisexuality for the first time. And so having that community of people who were all working on similar things. But again, I think I was probably the only one working on Bi+ parenting because it's like this kind of double erasure of, okay, you're bi, so we don't want to talk about you, but also parenting. So we also don't want to talk about that.
You know, it's interesting that you say being in a space where people actually kind of get what you're doing or excited about what you're doing. Jason and I recently went to the Bi+ World meetup, and in one of the small groups, we were talking about the difference between an accepting space and an affirming space. And Bi+ people are constantly, and I'm putting this in heavily, just like the most sarcastic quotes, accepting spaces. Oh, we included bi on the title, therefore it's accepting. But all three of us know that this is not the case. But the difference between that and being in a space as a researcher like the BRG to give a talk, everyone is so interested in your research and is like, I've seen this too, or I've noticed this as well. Did you think about this? Here's a resource. And all of a sudden your brain is just busy with possibility. And you're like, oh, this is what it could have been like the whole time, which is just to say, I'm so excited that the Bisexual Research Group exists. But you have taught across numerous universities at this point, tackling topics within both psychology and general social sciences. But given your focus on Bi+ parents and your interactions with young adults in these areas, what do you hope that the next generation keeps with them from your courses and research?
It's a really good question. I've taught on so many different topics that I think my answer cannot be a content-based thing. And I think ultimately when people leave university, I think they forget a lot of the actual content that you've spoken about. I know there's definitely things from uni that I haven't thought about since the day that I learned them. But what I hope that they've taken away is something research methods based, something about taking what you're reading critically and thinking about the methods of studies, particularly when they're portrayed in the media, just to actually think, are these findings representative, or is this sample representative, or are these findings accurate? What's affecting what's going on in the study? So just to be a bit more critical of what we read and think about the limitations of the research to date. And I think that's also really important because I'm hoping that these students that I've been teaching are the next generation of researchers. And the way that we find what we're going to research is by finding gaps or finding limitations in what has been done already to then build on that and to find out more, because obviously science is cumulative. So we're kind of constantly building on what has already been found and doing the next study. So hopefully this kind of criticality around research methods allows them to find the gaps and to find what needs to be done so that they can then go on to conduct the next cutting edge piece of research. That's what I would hope.
I love that. It's so important to be critical and reflexive about the how of the research and how it's conducted. I find it to be really, really important. And I think it's one of the most important pieces that I continue to learn and that we keep rehashing in class. It's definitely crucial. And to that extent, with all of the work that you've done on Bi+ parenting, what do you think is the most significant or the stickiest thing that you've discovered throughout your career?
These questions are big questions.
Yeah. We only ask big questions here.
Yeah.
I guess maybe one of the biggest things is just thinking about what's not there. So what is researched and what isn't? And I think when we start diving into what isn't researched, what isn't spoken about, we come back to these kind of these bigger systems of kind of monosexism in the case of my research that kind of dictate what we're able to think about or able to talk about or what is spoken about. So I think, yeah, again, this is something I'd also want my students to think about. What isn't being taught, basically, and why? And maybe that's partly because certain research is funded and certain research isn't. But I think, again, we come back to these like big structures that govern how we think and what is acceptable for people to, I'm doing air quotes, acceptable for people to research.
Absolutely. And I think that precisely this whole damage of silence thing is something that we keep coming back to as if some kind of boomerang, right? We're always drawn back to by representation and by erasure. Having them be overlooked, it's too much to be consistently and constantly not even mentioned. Hence, being a killjoy and bringing it into the room every single time. But your research focuses especially on bi+ parents and their experiences coming out to their children, especially when it comes to bi+ mothers.
Yeah. And in your article, How Do Bi+ Mothers Talk with Their Children About Their Bisexuality Plus, how bi+ people are just more likely to desire children and be parents overall within the LGBTQ+ communities. Why do you think that despite this, this fact, our representation in the parenting population, that we do continue to be overlooked and underrepresented?
Yeah, so this is something I was grappling with for many years because I was obviously immersing myself in the literature on LGBTQ parent families and on kind of LGBTQ topics more broadly, and just thinking, or just on parenting literature more broadly, and just thinking, why is it that we are so invisible as bi+ people? And I think some of the reasons overlap with kind of broader bi erasure, bi invisibility anyway, the fact that people don't think about us existing as bi+ people. And then that's spilling over into the research on families and parenting. But I published a paper last year in the Journal of Bisexuality about the kind of specific research practices that invisibilize and erase bi+ parents within the literature. So some of these that I kind of pointed to in the article were unlabeling, so referring to families, or I call it unlabeling, referring to families by their family structure as opposed to the sexual orientations of the parents. So saying things like 2 mother families or 2 father families, and then not reporting anything about the identities of these parents. And then that probably does include bi+ people who are parents, but then we're kind of not finding out anything about that specific population or how bi+ parents' experiences might be different to lesbian or gay parents' experiences, even if they're in the same family structure. Or also mislabeling, and some researchers do this kind of on purpose and some of them do it by accident, but referring to bi+ parents in same gender relationships as lesbian mothers or gay fathers, and just completely forgetting or choosing to forget that bi+ people exist. And I think, this is one of the big reasons that there's so little research on bi+ parents. But also like this LGBTQ umbrella, which obviously is really useful for uniting us with other people who have shared or similar experiences. But so often it's used within the literature. And then you'll have a study of 4,000 people and there'll be like 1 bi person in the sample. And then nothing will be said specifically about how bi people's experiences or bi parents' experiences might be different to anyone else underneath this umbrella. And it's just all of the nuances lost and we just learn nothing about bi+ parenting specifically. So I think those are kind of the big reasons or the big ways that bi+ people and bi+ parents specifically have been erased in the literature so far.
And you know that when you get a sample size that there's only 1 bi+ person in the sample size of 1,000, just like, that's not true. That is statistically unlikely.
Yeah.
Statistically unlikely. How many bi people like actually filled out that survey? Like, we're so keen on participating in things too.
Yeah, we are. We want to be included.
Yes, we do.
Something that really caught our attention from one of your articles is cultural socialization framework used within the data analysis. The How Do Bi+ Mother article defines this as the ways parents transmit cultural values, information, and customs to their children. But I want to pause because I don't think many of our listeners, including me, really know what a cultural socialization framework even is.
Sure. So I guess to give you a little bit of background on this study, it started off as a study of how bi+ mothers were coming out to their children. But through the interviews, through the analysis, I realized that it was so much broader than that. I think often we think about coming out as a conversation, and maybe I kind of wrongly went into this study with the idea that people would be telling me about conversations with their children, and it was so much broader than that. So I guess the reason I've used this kind of cultural socialization framework is to think about all the ways that people socialize their children in terms of immersing them in queer culture in various different ways. So maybe they took their children to Pride or to queer events, or told to their children about queer events, or had general conversations about our community or about the LGBTQ community. So it's just this idea that parents can transmit different values to their children. I mean, all parents transmit values to their children, but I'm specifically talking about queer cultural socialization. So how parents kind of taught their children about queer culture and immersed their children in queer.
Can you share a little bit about the importance of using this specific kind of framework within the study and bi+ parenting overall?
I think it helps us to think about bi+ parents coming out in a way that is not so focused on this conversation. It kind of problematizes the idea that coming out is like a straightforward conversation between one person and another. And it shows that this is, at least for some people, a much broader way of doing family or of family life, where children might learn about their mum being bi+ because, I don't know, the mum is wearing a t-shirt with the bi flag and the child asks, "What's that on your t-shirt?" And it's like it's permeating all different aspects of family life. Or, I don't know, they're taking their children to events like BiCon, which happens here in the UK, and their children are learning about queer history and queer life through this kind of immersion and learning about queer values. And I think this, parents often want to raise children who are really accepting. And so I think that's kind of how these values of acceptance are kind of taught to children.
You know, what's really interesting as you're talking about the socialization is the fact that we all do it all the time with kids, right? We're constantly socializing them into our culture, whatever that may be. And something that I've been really attuned to recently is the amount of queer books, that I give to my nieces and nephews just to make sure that they are aware that queerness is totally normal. And recently I was given an art copy of this. It's called The Bi Book. It's by AJ Irving. It's not even bound together. It's such an art copy. But it's just so beautiful and just talks about like bi is beautiful and this is what bi means, and has a little glossary of some big words that have the word bi in it. And I was thinking to myself, man, if I ever had a kid, I would absolutely just want to socialize them into knowing like bi is an option, bi is an option, bi is an option. But for these brief few years before kids start going out into the world and being socialized by other people, is like bisexual or anything under the bi+ umbrella is just normal, right? Like it's not queer enough. It's not too queer. Nothing about it is strange. It's just like an accepted thing that perhaps one of the parents is. And I'm like, oh, isn't that beautiful? How much easier would life have been for me if that had been modeled? But anyway, I totally digress. I think that's something that we were thinking about, as Jason and I are not parents. How can we as adults Jace, I actually don't know how many kids are in your life or how often you see children, but I live with a 5-year-old. How can we do better modeling for children about bi+ identity?
A brilliant way is exactly what you've already done, which is buy the book. I'm just so impressed. I'm still stuck on the book because so many parents in my research spoke about the lack of books for children. So I'm really impressed that you've managed to get your hands on one. And kind of in the absence of these books, a lot of bi+ mums in my research spoke about kind of creatively using media that already existed. So one example that jumps to mind was one mum who had these like little feminist board books. So they spoke about all different famous feminists. And this mom kind of pointed out which of these feminists were bi to the child. So saying things like, they've read the book about Frida Kahlo and then saying, oh, Frida Kahlo was bisexual just like mama. Oh. So, these kind of conversations, I think is a really lovely way to kind of bring that into conversations that you're having with children in it's a very appropriate child-friendly way, but in the absence of the media that kind of doesn't exist, like there's very few kids' books about bisexuality, maybe kind of creatively adding it in there when it's applicable.
And I think that tangentially to the topic of parenting and exposing children and like your own children to what it means to be bi or engage in bi culture, it's I feel like my brain is actively being tickled about how being bi is about so much more than just coming out, or as I like to say, just wearing the purple.
Yeah.
There is so much rich culture and history that is so beautiful and that we keep talking about here in Bisexual Killjoy, but that I still feel gets lost in translation, where it's like some folks get stuck on the sex of it all, or they get stuck on the shroud of promiscuity and such. And it's so beautiful to hear how exploring the experiences of bi plus parents is such a beautiful way in to how bi plusness is about connection and exploration and acceptance and embracing all of these values that are so fundamental for human life.
Yeah, and I think these parents wanted to teach about diversity even more broadly. So telling their children about all the different options that are available to them and all the different types of people. So teaching about different relationships and different types of families, but also teaching about kind of all the different kinds of diversity so that their children knew that people are all different and that's okay, basically, is kind of the broad message that lots of people were trying to transmit. So I think it becomes broader than just teaching about sexuality or teaching about different sexual orientations, but actually this kind of way of life of everybody is different and that's okay. And then that kind of comes alongside often this like unconditional acceptance that bi plus parents want to give their children that maybe is something that not all of them had. So kind of breaking the cycle, maybe if they hadn't experienced kind of acceptance from their parents, making sure their children knew that whatever they did, whoever they were, that was okay and that would be accepted and they would be loved regardless of that.
This is obviously just own observation of bi plus parents that I do know and how their approach to parenting is so different than, I was raised in a very Christian household in a very Christian part of America. So we'll start there. But there's such an allowance for curiosity with bi plus parents for their kids. Is like, I want you to ask me questions. I want you to figure things out for yourself. And all of the bi plus families that I've been around, and I guess queer families in general, is just how like warm they are and how welcoming. And a part of me wonders if it's just because we haven't necessarily gotten that warmth from our own families that we double down and we're like, we're going to be the nicest, most accepting freaking parents that ever existed, like aggressively so. What do you think about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's like trying to break the cycle, trying to give children the love that they deserve, right? And I think another thing is it's hard for people to parent in a world that is so heteronormative, because even if you're giving your children these messages of acceptance, of diversity, of love, that doesn't necessarily mean that they always hear such open messages. So I think a lot of parents spoke to me about kind of, I don't know, other members of the family might say something like, oh, when you're older and when you have a boyfriend, to the child. And then the parent would kind of chip in and say, or a girlfriend, or no partner, kind of telling children that all of these options are available to them and all of these options are okay. I think it can sometimes be hard for parents when people aren't always on the same page, right? And the messages that children get from society don't necessarily always align with the messages that they get in the household. And then how do you cope with that as a bi plus parent?
Yeah.
Another aspect that participants seemed really keen on addressing in your study had to do with the role of bi plusness, not just in their relationships with their children, but also with their current partners and other potential future partners. Can you share a little bit more about your findings in this area?
Yeah, I think there's definitely connections between, I think we need to think about the family as this kind of interconnected system of people. And when we're talking about parenting, we can't just think about the relationship between parents and children, but we have to think about kind of the broader family unit and what's going on and what relationship are parents in and what's happening there. So an example would be, I remember some participants telling me, oh, I had to come out to my daughter because I wanted to go on a date with a woman and my daughter had never seen me date a woman before. So there's kind of connections between dating or relationships and parenting and what kind of conversations people were having with their children were definitely really clear in that study. But also in my PhD research, the quantitative part, I was interested in looking at potential differences between bi plus parents or bi plus mothers specifically in different relationship constellations. So, for instance, do bi plus mothers with a male partner have better or worse mental health than those with a female partner, or those with multiple partners, or those with no partner? So kind of looking at these differences, because much of the research so far has kind of treated bi plus parents as this like one entity. But as bi plus people, we can be in so many different kind of structures of relationships, or relationship constellations, as I like to call them. So I think it's important to think about kind of being a bit more nuanced in that respect. Thinking a bit about, I don't know, how are bi plus mothers' experiences different depending on who they're dating or depending on who they're parenting with. But kind of contrary to what I predicted or what I hypothesized, actually I didn't find differences in mental health between the different groups that I was looking at. I don't know if that's just because I didn't have a big enough sample size. Also, my study is not a representative sample. Like, people are recruited through social media. It's a convenient sample. But yeah, I was kind of surprised by that, because much of the previous research has found differences in bi people's mental health based on their partner's gender.
Interesting. Well, I guess this is my question is, what kind of questions were you asking that were different than other research studies that have been done around bi plus parenting? Or queer parenting, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, there's so little on
I know.
bi plus parenting that much of what I was doing was different.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the study that we've been talking about for the most part of this podcast, how do bi plus mothers talk with their children about bisexuality? It's different because previous studies have kind of focused on why bi plus parents come out to their children, like if they do or if they don't, these kind of questions. Whereas I was a lot more interested in how. Like, what do these conversations actually look like? What does parenting actually look like? And that's how we come back to this idea of like cultural socialization or queer socialization. Because as I said, it's much broader than just those conversations. But yeah, in my PhD, lots of what I was doing was kind of novel in various ways, just because I was using standardized measures of things like maternal mental health and parenting, and thinking about how these things relate to each other. And this just hasn't been done with bi plus parents. And also looking at what matters for children, what matters for child well-being, and finding that it's parenting and parental stress and parental mental health that impact children's well-being, as opposed to family structure, because regardless of which relationship constellation parents were in, there were no significant differences in how children were doing. So basically what we're finding out is family processes are what's important rather than family structure.
Is there and forgive my ignorance on this, how are children's wellness outcomes measured?
So I used a standardized measure called the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire. It's a short questionnaire that's filled in by parents. There's also versions that you can use with adolescents themselves, or you can give teachers a version as well, but I just used the parent version. And parents are asked to report on their children's behavior on a Likert scale. So it's like from strongly agree to strongly disagree or something like that. So yeah, it's a standardized measure.
I am just so desirous of an 18-year study on queer parents just in general, see where their kids go and how to control for that. Oh, wouldn't that be something, right? Like in 20 years, we'd have some excellent data on the outcomes of queer parenting in general. But I guess I was also curious about, do you think that bi plusness poses any particular challenges in the context of raising children with a romantic partner? Or are there challenges similar to having a romantic partner without kids involved?
I think one that springs to mind that a subset of my participants spoke about was the challenge of talking about ex-partners with a child and then fearing that either this might kind of hurt the current partner's feelings, or that the child might think, oh, what's going to happen to daddy? I'm talking here about kind of, how do you explain bisexuality to a child? And then often people talk about kind of relationships. So saying something like, mummy used to date so-and-so who was of a different gender to current partner, as like an example. But then that sometimes, people were worried that that might kind of upset their current partner, or that the child might think that something's going to happen to daddy, typically, because most of the mothers who brought this up were in a mixed gender relationship.
Wow.
Bailey is just soaking up all of this information.
I'm sorry. Chase, if you have questions, you go ahead. I'm just sort of, grappling with this.
No, I mean, I also feel like I'm just soaking up all of this information. I've read your article a few times. I think that I myself have just been wondering a lot about what are some strengths that bi-plus parents bring to the table. But the more I think about it, the more I keep coming back to your previous answers of just, inclusivity and these beautiful values that being bi comes with. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that maybe it has a lot more to do with bi-plus parents who are in a position to be accepting of their bi-plusness, right? To be proud of being bi-plus and engaging with that community. Because I imagine that the scenario looks very different when you've internalized a lot of bi-negativity.
For sure. And we have to acknowledge, coming back to this point about research methods, we have to acknowledge that this sample is probably skewed and unrepresentative in many ways. Like, these are people who wanted to come to talk to me about being bi-plus for an hour or 2 hours. And typically people who want to talk about being bi-plus for an hour or 2 hours are people who are kind of more comfortable with their sexual orientation or have kind of accepted their bi-ness more. So yeah, there's definitely bi parents out there or bi-plus parents out there who maybe struggle more with kind of accepting their bi-plus identity, or maybe they're kind of earlier on in the timeline. Maybe they haven't spoken to their children about being bi-plus. Maybe they haven't told their partner that they're bi-plus. That's something that we have to kind of grapple with as bi-plus people. We might be dating people who are heterosexual, and some of these people might be queerphobic or biphobic. And so the picture isn't always as pretty. I think we have to acknowledge that this is a sample who are not necessarily representative, and there can be difficulties as a bi-plus person or a bi-plus parent.
Yeah, and I think the three of us are aware of the fact that bi-plus women in particular are at a heightened risk for domestic violence than other subsections of the queer population. I kind of wonder about, this fear that some of the mothers were talking about, like, oh, I'm concerned that it'll upset my partner or it'll pose a problem. If these folks had higher rates of internalized bi-negativity, because to me, based on what I know about kids, is they don't necessarily care or have concepts. And this is more of a parent's thing, that they've just had a lifetime of dealing with other people's reactions to their sexuality, which brings us to protective factors. This is the most interesting thing in the paper for me, but I am biased because I care a lot about it. But activism and involvement in LGBTQ plus communities are mentioned as protective factors in your paper. And we're both really passionate about this, but I'm writing about it right now in my own project. We all know how powerful community is. We just talked about the difference between accepting and like a celebrating community, what can do for you as an individual. Are there specific community factors that benefit bi-plus parents in particular that you found, or even if you didn't find it in this paper, but you've got like a hypothesis about?
I think I would say the most important thing is that the community is accepting of bi-plus parents, and both parts of that word. So what I would say is, in these interviews that I conducted with bi-plus mothers for that qualitative study that we've been talking about, people spoke to me a lot about community. And while some of these experiences were really positive, and community connectedness is known to be a protective factor or a resilience resource, we might call it, at the same time, that doesn't mean that every experience that bi-plus people have in the community is positive, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's kind of various aspects here. One being that the LGBTQ community is often not very parent-friendly or not very family-friendly, which means that sometimes bi-plus parents can't, or LGBTQ parents more broadly, can't access events or can't access these spaces because they have responsibilities in terms of childcare and they can't necessarily access the events that are happening. Or if they do go to these spaces, they're not set up for parents or they're not set up for families. But on the other side, parents spoke to me about going to kind of rainbow family events or LGBTQ family groups, and then also feeling like their experiences weren't necessarily represented in these groups, or what they were experiencing wasn't something that was spoken about. And I think that's because often these groups are mostly made up of lesbian and gay parents who typically take different routes to parenthood to bi-plus parents.
Mm-hmm.
So what we know is that most bi-plus parents become parents through what we would call unassisted conception, so sex,
mm-hmm.
which isn't typically the case for most lesbian and gay parents. So often the conversations that were happening in these LGBTQ parenting spaces weren't reflective of what was happening in bi-plus parents' lives. So I think, yeah, the biggest thing would be that there just needs to be more bi+ parent friendly spaces or bi+ parent spaces. I think that would be my big recommendation. Just if you are an LGBTQ organization and you're listening to this, how can you become more family friendly? How can you make sure that parents can access your spaces? And if you're an LGBTQ parenting organization, how can you make sure that bi+ parents are catered to?
Mm-hmm. Or at least let known that they are welcome to attend. I love this idea of telling orgs what they can do better, but there's something that we do hint at activism here and advocacy. And one thing that I wish bi+ people in general, but parents specifically knew is you also have a power to start your own group. You can start your own bi+ parenting group that, has your hours, is family friendly, and it's just full of people who get it. You don't need to explain anything about yourself. So if you are a bi+ parent listening to this and you're like, I don't have any other parents to talk to about any of this stuff, it can start with you. The fact that this project has grown in a year, far more so than Jace and I could ever believe, or the bi+ book gang sprung from 7 people to over 150. Like, there are so many bi+ people out there eager for connection, eager for other folks who just get it. And you're allowed to advocate for yourself as well.
And to that extent, Ellen, what are some things that you hope bi+ parents keep in mind when searching for a queer community to get involved in, or when starting their own?
This recommendation of starting their own, because I think, why not, if you can't find something in your area or out there that meets your needs, start your own. I think that would be my take-home message. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. That it's just, I think we have to be the ones to make the community, just like you've done with this podcast, just like we're doing with the Bisexual Research Group. These spaces don't exist if bi+ people don't make them. So I think, take the initiative. And also making use of online spaces as well.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there is something special about in-person contact, but at the same time, I think there is something really beautiful about the fact that we can connect across the world using the technology that we have. And that can be a really positive thing, to be able to connect with different people who aren't necessarily just limited to your kind of local area or to your city. So I think, connecting with people, sharing experiences is really helpful, particularly when traditional quote unquote parenting spaces can be so heteronormative. I think it's really important for bi+ parents to have these spaces. So many people spoke to me about these like heteronormative parenting spaces and just realizing, the whole world is heteronormative, but it's just amplified in parenting spaces. So I think that makes the need for community even more important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And now feels important to remind all of our listeners that you do not need to be in a same gender relationship to queer your relationship. That is not a prerequisite. You are queer, and that makes your relationship queer. I will say this as many times as I need to.
It's until you die. I'm going to be honest about that, Jace. You just have to say it every day.
I'll make it my signature in my email or something. This has been such a wonderful episode, Ellen. I am just so profoundly grateful for everything that we have discussed here today. I think that bi+ parenting is definitely a unique experience, as we've talked about here, with its own kind of superpowers. It is about accepting and embracing and getting all the warm and fuzzy feelings. And I'm not going to lie, I do think that being bi+ would make me a better parent. I definitely think it would 100% be a superpower. So this has been such a beautiful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I think it's so important that we talk about this topic. And I totally agree. Being bi+ would definitely make you a better parent. And so many parents in my research have spoken about this kind of, I like that you've called it a superpower, but these benefits of being bi+ for their family, particularly when they have queer children, but also people spoke about kind of, all these different scenarios that being bi+ has helped them in. And I think it's really important to acknowledge how it can be helpful for us when we build families as bi+ people.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And just to get back on the self-advocacy bandwagon just a second, if there are resources out there that you would like to see, make them. Make your resources. Something that I am pitching here gently is to collaborate with somebody on a bi+ history book for kids, because I'm so tired of seeing queer history books and queer handbooks that totally exclude the bi+ experience. And I'd be happy to co-write or just be a project manager. So let me know. But you, Ellen, what should we be on the lookout from you next?
Lots of things.
Yeah.
Hopefully. I just finished my PhD, so I have lots of things that I need to write up. So I want to write one paper from my PhD about meaning making. So it was a narrative study of bisexual plus mothers. And I was interested in how they make meaning of discrimination facing them, of minority stress facing them and their families, but also of how they make meaning of being bi plus and a mother. So how do these identities kind of come together in their mind, and how do they understand those identities as related to each other? And one of those ways is through this kind of pointing to the benefits of being bi plus for their family. And that is one way that people make meaning of their bi plus identity as beneficial for parenting. So that's definitely one thing I want to publish. I also want to publish something on bi plus mothers' mental health and how this relates to minority stress. So I found that self-acceptance of sexuality was incredibly important for mothers' self-esteem. So something around that I want to write. And also something about children's adjustment. So this idea that we spoke about earlier about what matters for children is family processes, is parenting stress, is maternal mental health, as opposed to family structure. So publishing that quantitative work I did where I compared different families based on the relationship structure that bi plus mothers in my study were in. So that's kind of what I want to publish, what I want to write. But I also have a chapter that's going to be in the Routledge Handbook of Bisexuality. So being a parenting killjoy, I guess, to be the one who's like, yes, we're going to talk about parenting when we're talking about bisexuality.
That's awesome. Congratulations. Big deal.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And then we also have an upcoming event with the Bisexual Research Group. Hopefully I'll see you both there. We have Dr. Liam Carhill joining us, who's from Nottingham Trent University here in the UK, and he's going to be talking about bi men's body image. Mm-hmm. So I think that's going to be a really important discussion for us to have. And that will be on the 12th of May at 5 p.m. British Summertime, 12 p.m. EST.
Excellent.
I am so excited. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ellen. We look forward to reading more of your work and all of these forthcoming publications and participating and learning so much more at the Bisexual Research Group, which is a fantastic group for literally anybody listening to this podcast. Presumably, you're at least a little bit of a nerd. So we're excited to hopefully meet some of you there. We also want to thank you personally for embodying the Bisexual Killjoy spirit in all of the work that you do, especially as it pertains to parenting, because yes, we should always include parenting in these discussions. Thank you so much for everything you're doing.
And as always, all of the resources that we discussed today will be linked in the summary, so you can check out these articles that we've been talking about. You can learn more about the Bisexual Research Group. You can also learn more about the Bi book that comes out via Random House in 2025 later this year. But thank you all for tuning into Bisexual Killjoy, where we know that bisexuality isn't a phase, it is a phenomenon. And to support us, share us with your friends, subscribe to our Substack, rate our podcast, preferably 5 stars. And as always, we want to hear from you. You can share your stories with us on Instagram or via email at bisexualkilljoy@gmail.com. And we'd still love to answer your questions in our advice column, Give It To Me Bi Plus. So check out the Substack for more details on that. And until next time, keep being a bisexual killjoy.
Stay bisexual and stay strong.